Hello and welcome to Board Game Gumbo. Today we're unboxing Euphoria, Build a Better Dystopia by Stonemaier Games, along with its expansion, Ignorance is Bliss. Let's go ahead and start with the base game here. Euphoria was originally published in 2013. It plays 2 to 6 players and about 60 minutes, with the expansion coming out in 2019. But between those times, they came out with a new printing of the base game, which you can actually tell the difference with this sticker here. So if you're looking for this game, you see it in a gaming store, you may want to specifically look for this sticker, and that shows you that it's the new printing, which comes with some trays in the box. So here is, looks like our rule book here. Euphoria is a worker placement game. You'll be putting out your workers, which are your dice, onto the main game board in order to accumulate resources and other things. Ultimately trying to put out these authority stars, which are how you win the game. Every player has 10 stars, which represent their authority in this sort of dystopian government. And when somebody puts out their last star, they win the game. Here we just have a quick rules summary and a bit of a reference guide. Having played Euphoria quite a few times before, I will say that this setup here is really helpful. I wish a lot more games kind of just took the effort to make specifically a setup card, just to make putting the game up before playing that much quicker. And then you have a turn overview here. Here's our different punch board. There's not a ton of it, but we have a couple things here. We have these resource multipliers, which come in each player color. And these are essentially just what they sound like. The resources in the game are not meant to be limited. So if you ever get a point where you run out of resources, you can use these. Instead of having 6 resources, you can just put 2 of them on the ×3 spot. We have some different buildings. So these are buildings that you can be constructed during the course of the game, and they become new locations that you can go to. And these are just to mark off certain locations when you're playing with less than 6 players. Finally, we've got some little tokens that just remind you of certain bonuses that may get applied throughout the course of the game. And some little markers that will block off certain areas that get unlocked throughout the course of play. And then we've got a couple more boards of the same. So let me go ahead and finish punching all these out real quick. So Stonemaier is really known for kind of nice components, and this game is no difference. The cardboard is nice and thick. The graphics are bright and interesting. This game has an interesting amount of humor in it. It's almost set in a idiocracy style future. So you have buildings like the Center for Reduced Literacy or the Cafeteria of Nameless Meat. So it's kind of got that quirky dystopian humor in it. Here's our game board here. As I said, Euphoria is a worker placement game. So a lot of what you're seeing here are elements of worker placement that you've seen in other games. You have locations that your workers can go to. That's basically any of the squares you see. These larger squares are joint areas where multiple workers can go. As far as the singular areas, you have 2 types. You have these squares that have the arrow next to them. That's essentially you can bump people off those spaces. So if I was here and the next player wants to be there, they can bump me off that space, which allows me to collect my worker without taking an action. So I actually don't really mind that. And then you have other spaces like this one that don't have the arrow, which means that you can't bump somebody off that space once they're there. Let's go ahead and take a look at the rest of our components here, which are the start of our GameTrayz. So again, this is different from the first printing of the game. If you have the older printing, it's not going to include these GameTrayz. And these will basically hold all your different resources and player pieces really nicely and just make it easier to set up the game and also to tear it down at the end of the night. And then in the back here, we have the rest of our components. So let's start with the player components first. Each player is going to get 4 dice in their player color. Your dice are your workers, and the different values on your dice are your workers' intelligence. Whenever you gain a worker or pull a worker off the board, you're going to roll the die, and then that value will stay there until you've placed the worker and then take it back up. You'll start with 2 workers, and you can recruit an additional 2 during the course of the game. There's also a mechanic where if your workers get too smart, they kind of figure out what's going on and flee your corporation. So there's a mechanic in the game where essentially you want to keep your workers as uninformed as possible. Other player components, each player is going to get 10 stars. These are your authority markers. And this is how the end of the game is triggered. So the first person to place their 10th star becomes the winner. If for some reason people place their 10th star at the same time, which can happen, there are various sort of tie-breaking mechanisms in the game. And then you have the different resources. So there's commodities and then there are resources, and it does matter between them. So for commodities, you've got energy, which are represented by these lightning bolts. You've got water, you've got food, and then you've got what they call bliss. And then for commodities, you have gold, stone, and clay. Last few things in here, each player is going to have a heart and a head meeple, and those will represent 2 of your essentially stats during the game, your morale, which is your heart, and your worker intelligence, which is the head token. More stars for our player. We've got some additional little tokens here. So as you can see on the game board, it's kind of broken up into 4 factions. So you have one faction here, and this is all their sort of area. You have the water faction down here, another faction over here, and then at the top, which you can't really see, you've got the sort of the green faction. But down here, you have these different tunnels, and this is representing the Subterran faction here, trying to tunnel into the Wastelander faction, because the Wastelander faction produces food and they want to get at the food. So you have these little miner meeples, which will start on the board at the beginning of each mining track. And as people use this action spot, it'll move down the track. And when it gets to the end, you've essentially dug a tunnel into the Wastelander territory. And now if you have a Subterran faction card, you can start using this spot to get those resources, the food resources. We also have these little tokens here. There are 4 of them, and those are to track the different allegiance tracks down here. So as I said, there's 4 factions in the game. There's the Euphorian faction, the E, the Subterran faction, the Wastelander faction, and then the Icarus faction. And they have this allegiance track that these tokens will move up during the course of the game when people take certain action spots on the board. When this token continues to move, it unlocks bonuses for players who have workers of these particular factions. And we actually haven't discussed that yet, so let's go and take a look at what else we have in here, which is going to be the cards for those different workers. So at the start of a game of Euphoria, everybody's going to be dealt 4 of these worker cards. They're going to choose 2 to keep, and 2 to discard. And of the 2 that remain, they're going to choose 1 to place face up in front of them, which will be active, and 1 to place face down in front of them, which will be inactive until later in the game. And these worker cards do a couple different things for you. One, they give you a special ability. So if this is the worker that you have out, it says when your worker is bumped by any player, you may pay 1 bliss to select that worker's knowledge instead of rolling it. And there are quite a few of these to choose from. Again, this is the Icarus faction, but we go here into the Euphorian faction and so on. So there are cards of each faction. So the first thing that these cards do is they give you the special ability that's on the card as long as the card is one of your face up workers. The second thing they allow you to do is if you completely dig a tunnel, if you have this faction, so if you have a subterran worker face up in front of you, you can use this action spot. And that's why this one spot here is ringed in a blue outline, which you may be able to see, whereas this one is not, and this one is not, because this is telling you you can only use this spot if you have a blue worker. And then finally, you have these allegiance tracks at the bottom. When those tokens move up, they unlock different bonuses. So for instance, if the blue track moved up into this range here, when you went to the aquifer, which is this spot here, you get 1 additional water. So the aquifer gives you a certain number of water based on the value of all the workers there. And if you have a blue worker face up and you go to the aquifer, however much water you get, you would get 1 extra if the allegiance token was at least this far on this track or farther. The second phase here allows you to get both bonuses from the tunneling spot. And then the third spot allows you, every player, to flip over any blue workers they have in front of them. The last spot allows everybody to put stars on blue workers that are in front of them. The other deck of cards we have here are the relic cards. Relic cards are used for the more powerful actions in the game. And they are just random items that, like a book, or they're relics of the past. So these are things that are not available in today's society, in the dystopian society, but things that people have kind of clung on to. What these cards allow you to do is some of the more powerful actions in the game. So again, putting out your authority tokens, your stars, is a big aspect of the game. That's something that you typically want to do. And a location like this one here allows you to do that. You see the little star there. So if you place a worker there, you can discard 3 of these relic cards to put out 1 of your stars, and it also advances the allegiance track for this faction. So that's why you typically want relic cards. The last few cards we have in here, we've got a few extra worker cards here. Put those aside. These are, on one side, are just little cheat sheets. So you'll deal 1 of these to each player. It'll just tell you what the different icons on the board mean. So the 4 commodities, and if you ever see this symbol, that's any commodity. The 3 resources, and any resources, tells you what the 4 allegiances, or the 4 factions are. And then any other sort of icon on the board is explained here. But on the back, you also have a choice you can make during the course of the game. While you're playing Euphoria, there's really only 3 things you can do on your turn. One thing you can do is you can place a worker. So you'll choose one of your dice and you'll put it out onto a spot on the board, and then you'll resolve that spot. Anytime you see something that's in dark here, that's something you have to pay. Anything with a white background is something that you get. That's one action you take on your turn. Second action you can take is you can pick up any number of your workers that are on the board. There may be instances where you want to leave your workers out there, but otherwise you pick up your worker. That's the other thing you can do on your turn. The third thing you can do is resolve this card. So again, you're going to be dealt 1 of these cards at random, and they're all slightly different. And on your turn, you can choose to resolve the card. To do that, you either discard this specific relic card, or any 2 relic cards, and then you choose one of the options. For this one, you can either choose to read a book or you can choose to burn a book. If you burn a book, you get to put one of your authority stars on this card, which is obviously good because you're trying to get rid of 10 of them. But if you read a book, you get to draw 2 new recruits, and those are those worker cards that we looked at earlier. And then you get to keep one of them, which will be face down unless somebody has already passed one of these spots that allow you to flip that worker type over, and then you could immediately put it out face up. And that's everything you get in the base game of Euphoria. Now let's quickly look at the expansion here, Ignorance is Bliss. So Ignorance is Bliss doesn't change the basic playtime for Euphoria, but it does add a solo mode. So now you can play the game with 1 to 6 players. We got just a little rule sheet here explaining your new components and how it changes setup. Here's our rule book for the solo rules. We've got some stickers here. So I don't believe that these are necessary for this board that we have here. I could be wrong, and I'll have to look into that. But I believe that this board is currently correct, so we may not have to apply these. Another thing we have here is player boards, sort of personal player boards, in each of the 6 colors. This is actually, if you've ever played base Euphoria, this is really helpful because this morale and intelligence track here, if you play with 6 players, it's all tracked on the main board and it can get really, really busy. So instead, you have an area specifically for your morale and your intelligence. And then of course, a spot to keep your authority stars, resources, commodities, and your workers as well. So it's a nice little addition just to have those. We've got a new key card. So this would basically just copies this. It is slightly different. This is actually one of the alternate rules to this game, but this 2, 3, or 4 of a kind rule is an optional rule in the base game, which is not on the key on the actual board. And then on the back, it has the board setup. So again, really helpful to just have this board set up at a glance and not have to go through the rule book. We've got a new sort of market board here. So again, you can acquire relics throughout the course of the game, typically by going to locations that allow you to just draw. And in the base game, you would just draw from the top of the deck. Whereas with this board, you have 4 relics out. And so you essentially have choice in what relic you take. Just you have to pay resources if you want anything other than the far right one. So just a nice little addition to give people a few more options. We have Punchboard for new locations, new buildings that will get built during the course of the game. These are exactly like the base game ones, but they replace the base game ones. So you can actually see the little icon there and denotes that this is the expansion locations. So when you play with these, you'll play with all of these and none of the base ones. And then if you choose to play with the base ones, you won't play with these as well. Here we just have some bigger resources. So some really big tokens for Bliss, just to count as, we typically use these as 5s. This is nice. These are actually a nice addition because you pretty much don't have to use these anymore. These boards, which often got used in the base game because resources would run out, with these 5 tokens, they're kind of unnecessary. It's extremely unlikely that you're going to need more than more than 30 Bliss tokens, which is what this bag represents. So that's a nice addition. And then we have new cards. So we're going to have our Automa cards in here. That's the AI cards whenever you want to play solo. But we're also going to have a brand new set of recruit cards. And again, they have a symbol on them to denote that they are from the expansion. If you use the expansion cards, you are not going to use the base game cards at all. They completely replace them. So here are our Automa cards for solo play. And then here we have the rest of our recruit cards. And aside from replacing the base game cards, there's actually a brand new mechanic, because there are, let's see if I can find them. There are now factionless cards in the game. So there's a couple different factionless cards that you can be dealt. A couple rules about these is you can only ever have one. And if you start with one of these, it has to be your face-up one, because there's no way to flip them over. If you gain one throughout the course of the game from completing your objective card, from completing this, and you draw one, and it's one of these, you get to play it face-up immediately. These have really, really strong abilities that you'll have for the entirety of the game, but they have no faction, which means that they don't allow you to use these tunnel spots on the board. If the tunnel gets completed, it's not a faction. It also, you don't gain any of the bonuses from the allegiance track for these guys, because they aren't a member of one of the factions. But again, their special ability is very powerful. So this guy here, whenever you use a tunnel, any one of the 3 tunnels, you gain both the resource and the card. So typically when you go to a tunnel, you're going to pay a resource, and you're going to pay a commodity, and you get a resource and a relic card. This guy, any tunnel you go to, any of the 3, you get both the resource and the card right from the get-go. So that's a very strong ability. But that's it. That's everything you get in Euphoria, the base game, as well as Euphoria Ignorance is Bliss from Stonemaier Games.